Zafra Taba, everybody. Good morning from the Lehman Center at Congregation Beth Shalom in beautiful Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It is a semi-muggy and foggy 75 degrees here. I took a 2.4-mile run this morning, which for such intrepid and fantastic runners like Elanit Helfand is not an impressive thing at all. But if I'm going to go and run in the Mediterranean heat, I need to be prepared because next week at this time, I will be coming to you either from Jerusalem or from Carmiel. I have to just clear it with my mother-in-law.
Okay, so I spoke to the executive director, and he said that you're leaving on Thursday and you're going to do the Wednesday class, and then, but you plan to have the class while you're in Israel as well?
The Monday class is happening from Israel. The Talmud class is happening. The Chassidut class, I'm going to take a week off because
because you're away for a week.
Yeah, I'm going to be away for. Well, I'm going to Israel. You know, you don't go to Israel for 3 days. That's
no,
not.
But only. That's why I'm saying only.
Oh, yeah, I'm gone for like 10 days. It's like 10. And I'm missing. I'm doing what rabbis are not supposed to do, which is I'm missing 2 Shabbatot. But that being said, like, you know, mostly I run the kids service, and you know, honestly, we didn't have Manny this week, and the kids service kind of runs on rails. The kids are pretty good, so we'll be good. All right, with that, any other housekeeping notes? How's everybody doing? Go ahead, Marion.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you all that today our Noreen celebrated 50 years in Israel and 50 years in Carmiel.
Yay!
Wow.
Thank you. And I just came back from a day out with a friend from Modi'in who came up here to take me out for lunch. And I then took her on 2 tours of Carmiel on the number 3 bus and the number 4 bus and then the number 3 bus, where we went to the Pittsburgh Memorial Promenade.
So you came to Israel in
72.
I was about to say July of 1970 or August of 1970. I was going to say 1973, but 1972.
Yeah, first of all.
Then they went and had a war on your behalf the next year.
Yeah.
And at that time, Carmiel itself was only 7 years old.
True.
Right.
And I was so tired that I just went into the chair exercise class by mistake.
Here, I'm going to ask the one last question. Noreen, as the historic resident of Carmiel, were there any stoplights in Carmiel in 1970?
No, not for many, many years.
Not even when I was here.
Right.
And we have very few now. There are roundabouts everywhere.
Beautiful. Just like Eilat. Eilat is like the leader of roundabouts in the state of Israel.
They're horrible.
All right. This is
Elisheva, you brought the roundabouts from Boston initially.
No,
right?
I never went anywhere near Boston. I lived in the western part of the state. And when they put roundabouts in some intersections, it was awful.
Oh, New Jersey has jug handles.
I know Mark wants to start, but are Israelis still interesting drivers, or have they calmed down?
Interesting is a very polite way to put it.
awesome. All right, we're going to kick it off by doing a small review of yesterday. We're going to try, and if you notice, my pacing is always interesting. If you noticed me pushing a little bit, there's a section here that's kind of sticky and halachic and isn't that exciting. We dealt with a little bit of it yesterday, and then it gets even more sticky. And by sticky, I mean, it's not so much complicated as much as it is like, I don't really know whether it's going to be satisfactory for all of us. So I might push past that to get to the next piece, which is a little bit more interesting, which is the very, very end of our Mishnah, which deals with, if you remember a couple weeks ago, the question of what things can you put on a shofar and what can you not put on a shofar? So with that, Elisheva, you're the first window open. I'll read the Aramaic, you'll read the English. My taima, shofar asehu, v'yom tov aseh, v'lo taaseh, v'ein aseh doche et lo taaseh v'aseh.
The Gemara asks, there is a principle that a positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah. With this in mind, What is the reason that one may not perform a prohibited labor on Rosh Hashanah to fulfill the positive mitzvah of sounding the shofar? The Gemara answers, sounding the shofar is a positive mitzvah, but performing prohibited labor on a festival violates both the positive mitzvah to rest and the prohibition against performing prohibited labor. And a positive mitzvah does not override both a prohibition and a positive mitzvah.
Okay, this is a beautiful piece of halachic logic. It falls apart a little bit when you get into the problem of the counting of mitzvot, because as most of you probably know, there is no authoritative counting of all 613 commandments. Rambam has his count, and Ramban has a different count, and a guy by the name of the Sefer Mitzvot Gedolot, aka the Smog. No kidding. His acronymial Hebrew name is the Smog. Has a count, and he has a rival, and his name is the Sefer Mitzvot Katanot. So it's the book of Great Commandments, and there's a book of Little Commandments, and the Sefer Mitzvot Katanot, aka the Smach, has a different accounting for the 613 commandments, and so on and so forth. I believe Rashbam also has an accounting, and there's another, I would say the most authoritative one, the easiest, most accessible, and the probably most widespread is a book called the Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch is a really interesting book because we have no idea who wrote it, right? So this is like a 13th or 14th century work that is a really well-written codex of the 613 commandments, and yet nobody's really clear who it's attributed to. Rabbi, if I recall, the Sefer Mitzvot Gedolot, the Smog, is written by Moses of Kusi, who is a French Jew who lived in the 12th and 13th century, making him one generation after Rashi. None of that matters for our purposes, but I always like to do this because it's interesting. So the basic principle here is the Talmud says, hey, a positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah. So can't I violate, the commandment of carrying my shofar in order to blow the shofar on behalf of the community? And the response from the rest of the Gemara is, aha, you can't do both the overriding of a positive, which is shvut, right? The positive commandment to rest on a yontiv, and the negative commandment against malacha, right? Doing labor. So you can violate a negative commandment in order to do a positive commandment, but you can't override a positive and a negative commandment in order to perform a positive commandment. Ilanit, who is a math professor, let me explain this to you very simply, right? 1 minus 1 equals 0. That's okay. Okay. 1 minus 2 is a negative number. That's not okay. I'm just kidding. But basically, that's the principle by which they're operating. Now, the reason I brought up the accounting for the mitzvot is a lot of the mitzvot are arguable, right? And whether there is a positive commandment, so like, for instance, I learned this when I was doing my tshuva a couple of years ago on digital devices on Shabbat. According to Rambam, there are, I think, 6 positive commandments of Shabbat and 10 negative commandments of Shabbat, or 12 negative commandments of Shabbat. And that gets really confusing. Like, why is this a commandment? And why is it like one of his positive commandments was literally like oneg Shabbat, and trying to figure out the question, like, how do you fulfill the commandment of being joyful on Shabbat, other than, of course, what we all know as oneg Shabbat, which is like on Friday night, having black and white cookies and cinnamon and chocolate babka, right? Like, I don't know. But we're getting into the complexity of, like, some rabbis say that a certain thing is a positive commandment, where other rabbis say, no, this only transgresses a negative. Okay, Rabbi Judy, go ahead.
Oh, I'm not muted. Oh, okay. So is it carrying the shofar that's the problem?
So when we go way back, so let's actually do it. We might as well just go back.
I'm sorry.
No. God forbid. It's
I had the
So
same
I don't
thing.
understand, if the shofar's in the synagogue, then it's there, then you're not transgressing. Or if you're within the Eruv and you carry the shofar to synagogue.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back and look at it.
That's all a question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Shofar shel Rosh Hashanah ein mavirin alav et hatchum ve'ein mafkichin alav et hagal. So the two lines that he's bringing up are, with regard to a shofar on Rosh Hashanah, one may not pass the Shabbat limit for it, i.e. to go and hear it. So the implication here is twofold, because we were talking about carrying the shofar, but now we're also talking about walking far. So how far is Carmiel from, what's the next town outside of Carmiel?
Further than the Shabbat limit, that's for sure.
Right, but what's it called? Give me the name.
Deir
Okay.
al-Assad or Majdal Krum are pretty close.
Majdal Krum sounds like an Arab town, yeah?
Yes.
Is there?
So
I
is
don't know
Deir
that-
al-Assad.
Yeah.
All right,
Deir
let's say
al-Assad
that-
has the
I was
best
saying
shvut.
Gilon, or.
Okay, we'll say Gilon, just so that we don't have to worry about whether there are any observant Jews in Majdal Krum, which there may be. I don't mean to look down on Majdal Krum.
I
Um,
realize.
But so let's say there's a Jew in Gilon and there's no synagogue, and they know they have to walk to Elisheva, Marion, and Noreen's shul in order to hear shofar. But it is beyond the tchum. Okay. The answer is, if they paskined the rabbi a week out, like, Rabbi, may I walk from my home on Rosh Hashanah to come and hear the shofar? The answer, according to this Mishnah, is no, because they would be violating two mitzvot, the positive commandment of shvut, of rest, and the negative commandment of malacha, which is one of the malachot would be the walking past the tchum on Yom Tov. So the answer that a good Rav in Carmiel would give is no, Bubala. Those of you in Gilon need to come the day before and stay at the hotel or crash on Elisheva's floor or in her garage or with the cat.
Have a guest room.
Right, a guest room, right?
Yes.
I would also
Yeah.
assume that Gilon actually has a synagogue, so it's probably not really a problem. But back in the day, that was really a concern. And really remember that there was a lot beyond the tchum, because this was a society that was 90% agricultural. So where the tchum was and how far people would have to walk. So like, this was a big, I have never really thought about this, but this was a big issue. This would have been a big issue, that the farmers who lived on the outskirts of Carmiel would potentially have to leave on Erev Rosh Hashanah and stay so that they could hear the shofar properly, or each collection of a couple farms would have to have someone who could blow the shofar for them and wouldn't violate. And remember, the blowing is probably less of a problem than the acquisition of a shofar, which may have been difficult back in those days. Because, you know, as I always remember when I watched the movie Fiddler on the Roof, not the musical version, but there's like an old like silent version, I think. Tevye, when he gets kicked out of Anatevka, spoiler alert, at the end of the movie, Tevye and his family have to leave
We all
Anatevka.
know that.
I don't know if that's true. I don't know. Some of us are younger. Yelani might be shocked that I've ruined the end of Fiddler on the Roof for her. But when he leaves, you may have never seen the silent version, but he reaches up and he gets all of his earthly possessions. And all of his earthly possessions are a prayer book, a book of Tehillim, his talit, and a little satchel. And that's all he owns. Like he owns, and like a milk jug.
Tefillin?
Yeah, I don't think so. Not in the movie anyways. Tevye wasn't there yet. All right. Okay, so anyhow, I think that answers your question, right, Judy? That we're talking about walking on Yontiv, and we're talking about walking on Yontiv beyond the Tchum. Now, but I think your point stands better because you asked it, which is that what's really going on here is we're talking about the broader principle of, we're abstracting out and we're asking a legal principle that applies to every mitzvah in Judaism, which is, at what point are you permitted to transgress something in order to fulfill something else? There's a famous line in the conservative movement that was used in the 1955 tshuva that allowed you to drive and use electricity on Shabbat, which was possibly the most controversial part of the tshuva, which is that one of the arguments that it made was a line from the Gemara that says, one may transgress one Shabbat so that one may observe many Shabbats. And that section is a piece of text that's taken from a part of the Talmud that deals with why you can run into a burning house to pick somebody up and save them on Shabbat, or why you can grab a hose and extinguish a fire on Shabbat. And the answer is one may violate one Shabbat in order to observe many, meaning the saving of a life, pikuach nefesh, allows someone to be, you break Shabbat once, but you're allowing someone else to observe, the next 4,000 Shabbats because they're not dead. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because the rabbis in 1955 in the conservative movement used this, I think maybe it was 59, or maybe it was 50, it was 1950, used that as an argument for why you could drive your motor car to services, because the hope was you would go to synagogue a bunch of times and you would really, really be compelled by it. And then you would become more observant and eventually buy a house across the street from the synagogue and no longer drive on Shabbat. That was their use of how they understood the possibility of one can violate one Shabbat in order to observe many. Today, the vast majority of conservative Jews drive to synagogue on Shabbat because that's where we live. And a lot of our older members, it's just not possible, right? It's just, they're physically incapable of walking. Now in Israel, maybe one of the things that's really interesting about the way Israel organized itself as a society is many of the synagogues, basically, if your neighborhood gets big enough and there's enough demand, the state of Israel will just build you another synagogue right in the neighborhood. And you can
An Orthodox one.
An Orthodox
Orthodox
almost
one.
certainly an Orthodox one. That's true. The non-Orthodox almost certainly have to build their own. So
Yes.
at least until I take over, and then until
I have an Orthodox synagogue across the street from me, but they would never let me enter the place.
Yeah, when I'm in Jerusalem next week, I have my choice of many Orthodox synagogues that I will walk past on my way to an egalitarian synagogue for Shabbat. So, but I've never, there's a couple for Shabbat that I've never been to that I'd like to try out. So that'll be interesting.
Where will you be?
Egalitarian, so definitely not Orthodox. Although you're right, there's two big semi-egalitarian ones in Jerusalem that are close to where I will be staying.
Yeah,
So,
where?
Shira Hadashah, which is a partnership minyan. You need 10 men and 10 women in order to start. And then there's Yakar. Yakar is pretty much straightforward Orthodox, except the Mechitza is right down the middle, and they're a little bit more progressive with things like, I think, letting women carry the Torah. So, but women can't actually.
It's Jeremy Rosen, I think.
Cool. All right.
And incidentally, the nearest town to Carmiel is Shazor, which is only 7 kilometers away. However, they most definitely have their own synagogue.
Nice.
That's for
Nice.
sure.
All right,
Yeah.
Noreen has a question, and then Rav Judy.
No, that was it. It wasn't a question. It was just an interjection.
You wanted to tell us about Shazor. Great.
Yeah.
Now I know which towns I will pass through on the train on my way to your house.
Not Shazor, it's the wrong direction.
Shazor,
Train doesn't
right.
go as far.
I was about to say, or I will know that if I get to Shazor, I've been on the train too long. Okay.
Carmiel is the last stop on the train. You can't miss it.
Solves the problem. I can fall asleep then. Fantastic. All right,
Yes,
Judy.
you can.
Hopefully my wife was amenable to the idea of bringing the whole family. So you might meet the small Goodmans also.
That would be lovely.
Right. They'll all be like, why are we here? And I'll be like, you're here to meet Elisheva and Marion and Noreen. So, all right, Judy, go ahead.
Well, the reality of that 1950 decision by the conservative movement was Jews were flocking to the suburbs. So they wanted them to go to synagogue.
Right.
So that's a simple demographic thing, and it's a living religion.
Yeah.
The challenge of the, go ahead.
I lived in Larchmont, Westchester County for 33 years. The neighboring town, it was the same school district, was Maronac, and there was a big conservative synagogue, and they barricaded the parking lot on Shabbat. So people still drove to the synagogue, but then they had to find street parking. So what can I say?
The Orthodox synagogue near us did the same thing. They fenced off their parking lot, and the entire block was filled with all of their driving members parked on the street.
Yep. Okay, so Marion, did you want to say something?
Yeah. Here I walk. I don't ride on Shabbat as a rule. unless there's some very, very good reason. But in the States, if I'm visiting my kids or my brother, I have no choice. I know the distances are such that it's impossible to get to a synagogue without riding.
Right.
So also, and there are some people in our congregation that live too far away. And of course, there's no buses or anything like that on Shabbat either.
Right.
So, yeah.
No,
What else am I gonna say?
yeah, I mean, the challenge with the tshuva, Judy, is basically that it's not one of the stronger tshuvot in the movement. And so all my snooty intellectual colleagues say we should have never passed the driving tshuva because the legal reasoning that it's riding on isn't strong enough. And my response to that to some degree is, and forgive me if this is an inarticulate or imprecise analogy, but it's not unlike the argument that the Supreme Court is just dealt with in the United States regarding Roe v. Wade, which is the 6 justices who overturned Roe v. Wade were arguing a logical point, which I don't entirely disagree with, which is they basically said nowhere in the US Constitution does it explicitly state that abortion is permitted, and therefore the original decision of Roe v. Wade in 1972 was illegitimate. Now, that might be true. It might be true, right? I don't think it's true, but it might be true. The problem with the logic is you're overturning 50 years of settled law. And with the conservative movement and the driving tshuva, in order to say this isn't a very good tshuva, let's get rid of it, you're overturning 75 years of settled law, right? And so the idea then, the parallel between the two, to explain a little bit. Now, by the way, one is just, can I get in a car on Shabbat? And one is a life or death issue for women. So that's where this one breaks down very seriously. But the parallel between the two is when you have a long-standing settled law that that some people, for intellectual purposes, are dissatisfied with the mechanics of it, is that reason enough to overturn it? And my answer is overwhelmingly no, right? Even if you don't like the basis for the law, once it's been around for a long time, you ought to keep it. Apparently, 6 of our most eminent justices in America do not agree with that principle. Oh, well.
I wouldn't
Nope.
use the word eminent.
Yeah, right. Well, I use that perhaps slightly tongue in cheek. Okay, let's keep going. Marion, you're next up. I'll do the Hebrew. Lo olin be'ilan v'lo rochvin al gabe behema v'chule. Hashta be'rabanan amrat la deoraita mi boy zo ve'ein sarich lomar zo katani.
The Mishnah taught, one may not pass the Shabbat limit for it, that is, to go and hear it, nor may one clear a pile of rubble to uncover a buried shofar. One may not climb a tree, nor may one ride on an animal to find a shofar to sound. The Gemara questions the order of these prohibitions. Now that you have said that to sound the shofar, one may not perform an action that is prohibited by rabbinic law, that is, passing the Shabbat limit or clearing a pile of rubble, is it necessary to say that one may not perform an action that could lead to an act prohibited by Torah law, that is, climbing a tree or riding an animal? The Gemara answers, the Mishnah teaches employing the style this, and it is unnecessary to say that. It begins with the more novel case before moving on to the more straightforward one.
Great. So this is that piece where one of those moments where if you don't have Steinsaltz, you either have a real problem, or as a Talmud student, you sit there scratching your head with your chavruta for a half an hour before hoping that the teacher explains it on Monday morning to you. So the Gemara ended with the words zo ve'ein sorich lomar zo katani, which is like, literally translates as this, and one does not need to say this, it is taught, which, like, for me is just complete gibberish. Like, I would not have understood that had Steinsaltz not had concluded by saying it begins with the more novel case before moving on to the more straightforward one. So the whole problem that the Gemara is raising is the Gemara is annoyed with the order by which the Mishnah has laid out this case, which is you may not pass the Shabbat Tehum nor may you bury a shofar on Shabbat. Semicolon, nor may you climb a tree, nor may you ride an animal. And the problem the Talmud has is the order, right? Which is, once I know I can't pass the Shabbat boundary, don't I automatically know that I can't also climb a tree or ride an animal? Then the Talmud kind of concludes by saying it begins with the more novel case before moving on to the straightforward one, right? Like, it's telling you a broad principle that is important before specifically mentioning two kinds of quote unquote straightforward cases, which you probably should have known anyways. I don't think that logic really satisfies me, but it satisfies the Talmud because they just move on from here. So that's the place where I think it's an interesting one, but it follows a certain kind of Talmudic logic. All right, with that, we're moving on to 33a. We finished a page of Talmud.
Yay!
In this class, we move so slowly that I get excited when we do these things, and that's good. That's good. But also, it's all arbitrary, and where we draw the lines are completely made up. So with that, Rav Judy, will you read to us in the English, and I will do the. This one's all Aramaic. Well, it's a mix. Ein chotchin oto, bein b'davar shehu mishum shvut, ubein b'davar shehu mishum lo taaseh. Mishum shvut, magala, lo taaseh, sakina.
The Mishnah stated, one may not cut the shofar if it needs to be prepared, neither with an object that is prohibited due to a rabbinic decree, nor with an object that may not be used due to a Torah prohibition. The Gemara explains, an example of an object prohibited due to a rabbinic decree is a sickle, which is not ordinarily used for preparing a shofar. An example of an object that may not be used due to a prohibition by Torah law is a knife.
Okay, this is a little weird, but I'll explain it, and it has some broader application, but not really. So the taaseh velo taaseh are what are referred to as doraita laws, right? Doraita is a category of Torah laws that are, for lack of a better term, explicitly mentioned in the Torah. Now, by the way, what is explicitly mentioned in the Torah was determined by the rabbis. And so already we're getting into a kind of subjective category. I'll give you an example. The 39 categories of violations of Shabbat are supposedly deoraita, but all 39 categories are derived by the rabbis, and they're not explicitly mentioned in the Torah as these are the 39 categories of things you cannot do on Shabbat. They're just 37 of them are things that you would do to erect the tabernacle on Shabbat, but we know that they didn't erect a tabernacle on Shabbat, and therefore all 37 of those things are forbidden. The other 2 out of the 39 are things where someone literally dies for doing them in the Torah, right? So like carrying on Shabbat is forbidden because there's a story in the Torah of a guy who carries some sticks on Shabbat, and they put him to death. And by the way, there's no mention in the Torah before this dude is put to death that that's a prohibition. But afterwards, we all know clearly I should not go wandering around Squirrel Hill picking up sticks on Shabbat because someone at Pol Tzedek will put me to death. Okay. You can't carry a baby either unless you have an Eruv, and then you're fine. Okay. So contribute to your local Eruv. Anyways, or in Israel, it's maintained by the federal government. Okay. So anyhow, that's the big category of deoraita laws. Aside from deoraita laws, there's a set of rabbinic laws which are referred to as shvut. And shvut are, for lack of a better word, shvut is derived from the Hebrew word Shabbat and lashevet. And I would translate shvut as desist, right? These are laws that are not explicitly forbidden according to the Torah, but the rabbis added them. You could also refer to these as the fence around the laws, although it's not a perfect translation because of this concept of shvut being desist. But shvut is a whole legal category that gets really, really complicated. Another way of saying them, though, is these are what's called derabanan. So there are 2 categories of Jewish law that the rabbis delineated, deoraita and derabanan. Derabanan are the fence around the fence laws, that one would have. So a great example of this is the entire category in Shabbat of muktzah, right? It's not that I can't pick up a pen on Shabbat. I can. There's no prohibition against me picking up a pen on Shabbat. The problem with picking up a pen on Shabbat is I might write with it, right? So, and I'm not allowed to write with it on Shabbat. So even if, which happens a lot in my house, even if there's a bunch of pens and a bunch of computers on our dining room table, right as I'm ready to put out Shabbat dinner, and it's already been Shabbat for an hour, I'm not technically permitted to move the pen off of the dining room table. So what I usually do is I take the newspaper and I push it and I slide the pen onto the newspaper, and then I move the newspaper, which, by the way, is permitted. You can move a thing that has another thing on it, as long as you're not directly doing it. There's another way to do it because it's a derabanan, which is you can move something lo kadarko. You can pick something up. So like, let's say my cell phone, let's say I didn't believe in using a cell phone on Shabbat, and I saw my cell phone on the dining room table right before Shabbat dinner, and it's Shabbat already, and I want to move it. So instead of picking it up with my right hand, as I normally would, I'll pick it up backwards with my left hand. And if I hold it like this, my brain knows that I'm not going to use my phone like this because I don't normally use my phone like this. And so I can carry it and put it down somewhere else. All right, Elisheva had a question, and then Judy.
I thought when something was in the way, in particular of a meal, that you could move it, even though you could not even touch it for other reasons.
You may move it, but you should move it lo kadarko, meaning you should slide it onto like a platter or a plate or something else. The exception also is very expensive objects. You can move in a so like if you, and I remember I have a wonderful children's book with this called The 39 Melachot of Shabbat. And in the picture, there's a whole category of muktzah of things you're allowed to move. And the guy has a really fancy camera on a tripod right next to the Shabbat dinner table, which begs the question, why would you set up a camera next to the Shabbat? But the answer is, it's used for instructive purposes. You can move it. But that's an example of a shvut that is not a lo taaseh. Okay, to finish the section, and then Judy, I'll let you ask your question or make your comment. The rabbis have a very interesting thing. They basically decree, so a sickle is not forbidden on Yom Tov to be used. It's not specifically forbidden. So you could pick up a sickle. You couldn't harvest with it, but you could apparently pick it up. And you might even, at least according to the way the rabbis are literally reading the law, you might have otherwise used a sickle on a shofar in order to cut it. Now, the basic assumption here is, remember, going way back when we were talking about how to build a shofar is a horn, right? To get a blowable end out of it, you have to cut the point off in order to make it work. So the doraita is, if you're using a knife to cut the horn, that's forbidden. Okay, by the way, to do this, you would soften it. You would heat it up and get it very warm so that it would also be malleable. Either that or you use a saw. But the question is, can you use a sickle to cut it? Maybe I don't want to like cut the end off it. Maybe I just want to scratch, a mark onto it so people know this is my shofar and it's not Rabbi Judy's shofar, right? Could I use a sickle here? And the answer is, well, chatchu is officially the word that is applied to the word knife, but Rabbanan, the rabbis decreed an entire category of other vessels that one or tools that one may not use on a shofar, a sickle being included in them. This feels a little like weird, but this is the rabbis trying to get out the bigger principle of how shvut and lo taaseh work. Judy, and then Elisheva.
I also have that children's book about the 39 Melachot that I bought for myself, not for anybody else.
Yep.
Muktzah, is that the word for something that you can't touch, like keys on Shabbat and stuff like that?
Yep.
I'm pronouncing it right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
All good. Elisheva, go ahead.
I would think that the prohibition about cutting a shofar would depend less on what tool you use and more on the fact that one is engaging in destruction and creation, which you're not allowed to do by cutting it.
I would think so too. but apparently the rabbis don't agree with us. I think the other thing is,
Or
so
they're focused on tools right now, so they're ignoring the other issue.
yeah, I mean, there's also the problem of one of the 39 categories, which is the least applicable, is what's called striking the final hammer blow, right? Like you can't there's a principle, like let's say you had a 1,000-piece puzzle and you got 999 pieces done and it's still Shabbat. Technically, you're not supposed to put the 1,000th piece in the puzzle because you've finished an action. Early on, once upon a time, some rabbis in the 20th century believed that one of the major problems of flicking on a light switch was completing a circuit. And completing a circuit was a violation of striking the final hammer blow. I think potentially that cutting open the end of a shofar would qualify as finishing it. Therefore, it would be striking the final hammer blow. The rabbis are not, to be honest, Elisheva, the rabbis are not really interested in the literal here. They're really interested in applying a halachic framework here and asking how many angels could dance on the head of a pin question. Because there are probably 7 different ways in which the shofar and cutting a shofar is a violation. They're really interested in the intellectual proposition of, if I cut it with this versus that, is it a different, might it be permitted? And the answer is, it's also forbidden, but forbidden in a different way, right? Let's say I'm using any implement that I wouldn't normally use to cut on Shabbat. Am I allowed to use that? And the answer is no, because it's less about the vessel than the action, but that's a rabbinic decree. Okay, with that, we're going to keep going because this is going to continue and finish by being, this is the Zov Ein Sarich Lomar Zo Katani that I needed help with. Hashta Mishum Shvut Amrat La Lo Taaseh Mi Boy Zov Ein Sarich Lomar Zo Katani. All right, Renee, will you read this in the English?
Yes. The Gemara asks, now that you have said that to sound the shofar, one may not perform an action that is prohibited due to rabbinic law, is it necessary to say that one may not perform an action that violates a prohibition by the Torah law? The Gemara answers, the Mishnah teaches employing the style, this, and it is unnecessary to say that.
Okay. So again, the order is the problem here, but also this statement that Steinsaltz adds clarifies things a little bit, which is, yeah, you might, the whole problem with the cutting of a shofar on Yontiv is really getting back to our original proposition, which is, remember, the original proposition was, if a person has to walk beyond the tchum to hear shofar, are they permitted to do that, even though they will be doing a violation in order to fulfill a mitzvah? Here, we have a similar case, of course, which is the assumption that we're talking about with the shofar is a shofar that needs to be cut because the only shofar in Gilon, or the only shofar in Carmiel that the entire town happens to have, is an uncut shofar, right? Like we've got one shofar for the whole town, and Rosh Hashanah has arrived, but Chaim Yankel forgot to cut it open on the open side. Can we cut it with a knife in order to open it so we can blow the shofar, so we can fulfill the mitzvah of blowing shofar? And the answer is no. So then the question basically that's thrown out there is, what about with a sickle instead of a knife, right? Which is really strange, but the answer is still no. So then they basically say, wait a second, why is the order here that it is prohibited due to rabbinic law? Why do we then need to go forward and clarify right after that would also violate a lo taaseh? And the answer is, if you say this, it is unnecessary to say that, right? If it's forbidden by, effectively, if it's forbidden by local law, then you don't really need to mention that it's additionally forbidden by federal law, right? Because it's kind of like, well, you're in Pittsburgh, like you're out of luck. That's the rule. All right, let's keep going because now we're into the part that I think is actually really interesting. Because all of that was about kind of like the logical intellect of why order it this way and why do it that way, even though we did ultimately get the kind of bigger idea out of different categories of prohibition. By the way, when I was in rabbinical school, I kind of asked, like, what does it matter when you're violating something of the difference between D is read ahead, so that's why she's chuckling. Why does it matter the difference between violating a lo taaseh and violating a shvut? Technically, back in the day, violating a lo taaseh of Shabbat was punishable by death. Violating a violating a lo taaseh, violating a shvut is punishable by lashes. So the difference is in the punishment, at least back in the day. So violating a derabanan gezerah is less of a problem. Okay, let's keep going. I'll read the English. I'll read the Hebrew, and Renee, why don't you keep reading the English because you didn't read a lot before. Aval, im ratza liten letocha maim o yain, yiten. Maim o yain in me reglaim la.
The Mishnah continues. However, if one wishes to place water or wine into the shofar on Rosh Hashanah so that it should emit a clear sound, he may place it. The Gemara infers, water or wine, yes, one may insert those substances into a shofar. However, urine whose acidity is good for the shofar, no.
Okay. Very good. So, so remember, if we go back a couple of a week or two to the last time we spoke about this, the Mishnah points out that one can put water or wine into a shofar. It doesn't explain why one would do that. Rashi comes to explain, and Steinsaltz continues that putting water or wine may be either to clean it or to varnish it so that it gets a nicer sound. I also threw out the possibility that if one, closes up one end of a shofar, one has a wineskin or a water skin, right? A horn was a really good way to carry liquid back in the day. But they add, one may put water or wine into it, but not urine, okay? Which begs the question, why are you going to pee in a shofar? Why would anyone put pee in a shofar? So that is actually worthwhile exploring. Why indeed might one put pee in a shofar? And the answer is that Steinsaltz gives is whose acidity is good for the shofar. No. So in the greater comments that he adds down here, what he's really talking about is he uses the word and the text will go on and use the word metzachtzech, that they are used as polish, right? That water and wine and urine, the acidity of the urea, would give a good polish or shine to the either outside or inside of the shofar. Now, one might stop and say to themselves, it is obvious that one would not want to pee in a holy vessel like a shofar, but the Talmud brings it up. And I think it's worthwhile. I think there are certain beliefs in Judaism about the holiness of objects that we get like stuck in our heads, right? Like I see kids all the time when a kippah falls on the ground, they'll pick it up and they'll kiss it. There's nothing magical about this funny little thing. It has no holiness value whatsoever. It is actually technically no holier than a Pirates baseball cap, or more importantly, a Dodgers baseball cap, right? You do not need to kiss it when it falls on the ground. And yet people feel that way. Back in the day, one of the things I've learned from a lot of Talmud study is physical objects didn't really have quite as great a sense of holiness as and with the great regard that we hold them in today. Additionally, a lot of the basic natural materials that were available back then were commonly used for all sorts of items that you would have never expected them to. I remember being very shocked in rabbinical school when there was a study in, I think, Tractate Brachot, which dealt with the fact that a rabbi was carrying around a necklace with the bone of his child around his neck, right? And the rabbis in the Tosafot, that's the 11th and 12th and 13th century French commentators, spent a lot of time asking questions about whether this was really possible, since the bone of human beings carries teuma and tahara, right? It is it is ritually impure to be in contact with a physical implement from the dead, which the Talmud then continues to elucidate by discussing the fact that bones, right, are regularly used items throughout Israel for lots and lots of things. Typically not human bones, but you might think to yourself, right, like, who would take the skull of an animal and use it? And the answer is lots of people, right? You would cut it and you would have a really lovely bowl, right? If you polished it and you cleaned it and you used it the right way, right? Bone was really useful in a lot of different ways. In fact, all dice in the old days were made of bone. There was all sorts of uses back in the day of bone. And so we don't blink at all at the idea that someone would take cattle bones or deer bones and use them for regular implements and items on the daily basis. But we do suddenly go, ooh, urine in a shofar. You would never do that, right? So there's all these kinds of, I just use that as an example, but there's all these kinds of places where the way we think today as moderns of items being holy and you would never do X, Y, or Z with it, they didn't think that way back then. All right, Renee and then Elisheva.
I remember many years ago, my dad bought me a necklace, and the necklace had a piece of ivory in it that was carved and painted.
Sure.
And I wore it. And remember, I went to an Orthodox synagogue, never thinking, and I wore it there. And the Rebbitzin said to me that if I was going to wear it again, I would have to make a mark in it. I would have to desecrate it in some way to be able to wear it. Now, I can't explain it, but it happened.
That's so interesting. In Erie, we have an ivory, yad for the Torah. And, it's a really interesting, moral problem, because ivory, of course, is harvested from elephants and from the slaughter, and today the poaching of elephants. But I argue that it's fine to use it, because by having it, we are not encouraging our members to go out and purchase and harvest more ivory. It's good to have this ivory and say, like, we're never going to do this again, right? It's actually a great.
And this goes back 45 years.
Sure, right.
So,
before that was a problem. I want to add another piece that Steinsaltz said before we get to Judy. Oh no, Elisheva. Elisheva, go, and then we'll add the Steinsaltz.
I'm just intrigued by the euphemism. If urine was perfectly okay to use, why have a euphemism, me raglaim?
Right. So let's explain that, because we didn't explain it. The Hebrew here literally translates. Go ahead, Elisheva. What is me raglaim?
Feet water of feet.
Leg water. Yeah, leg water.
Yeah.
What would that be?
Miriam, what was that?
I know, what would that be?
Right. It's a Talmudic euphemism for pee. That's what it is. I know it because I've learned this before.
But if it's an ordinary thing that you might use, why do you need a euphemism?
It's interesting that you say it's a euphemism, because this is the only word I know from studying Talmud. This phrase also shows up, I think, in Psachim, and it may also show up in Brachot. And I know that because I've come across this word multiple times. I actually don't know any other Talmudic word for urine. So you might be right that this is a euphemism, but this is the word that the Talmud uses for it. So it may not exactly be a euphemism, it may just be the original construction. Can I ask, what is the word in modern Hebrew for pee?
Shetin.
I guess
Shetin.
Seten.
Shetin.
Sheten. Very good. I know the word to pee, which is lahashtin, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
So
same.
Sheten is the noun form of lahashtin, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's interesting, because it was not back then.
But even if this is the only term that's ever used in the Talmud, it clearly is not a direct description of the substance.
That's right.
It has to be a euphemism.
There should have been a better
It
word.
may be
for
such a
pee.
common euphemism that people don't think about it, but.
Right. Mark it down today, everyone. Elisheva's objection to our text of Talmud is this construction of the word pee. That's what's bothering Elisheva today. Okay. Judy, you have a question?
So I'm trying to figure this out. water or wine or urine, is that like you're manufacturing something? Is that like you're taking this object and improving it and it's a form of work, but yet you can do the water and the wine, but you can't do the urine?
Right.
And I think that the water on your legs or your feet is a wonderful description
Nice.
of urine. It's awesome.
If your accuracy isn't good, then you have water on your feet. That's right.
No, right. Come on, let's picture it. They were picturing it. But no, but seriously, what is the issue? Is placing any kind of liquid in the shofar on the holy day in and of itself work, but it's okay to do wine and water, but not urine? That's the part I don't get.
Right. Well, the thing that you bring up, which is really great, is that we were talking about things you can't do on Rosh Hashanah. And now we seem to have jumped out to talking about things you probably shouldn't do altogether, but it's not clear, no pun intended.
Oh, okay, right, got it.
It seems like we've jumped out to talking about you can put water and wine on a shofar any day because, you know, that's not a prohibition on Rosh Hashanah, but you can't do urine on any day. So with that, let's read this next section, and Noreen, if you'll read the English, and we'll get part of our answer, and then I'll read this little Steinsaltz piece because it's actually connected to the next piece. And it'll bring up two other little subtexts that Steinsaltz is bringing according to somebody called the shofar, who I'd have to look up what that acronym means. All right. Matnitin mani, Abba Shaul hi, Titania Abba Shaul Omer, Maim o yain mutar, Kedei letzach tzecho, Me reglaim asur mipnei hakavod.
The Gemara asks, who is the Tana of the Mishnah? The Gemara answers, it is Abba Shaul, as it is taught in a Baraita that Abba Shaul says, with regard to water or wine, one is permitted to pour these liquids into a shofar on Rosh Hashanah in order to make it sound clear. However, with regard to urine, one is permitted to do so due to the respect that must be shown to the shofar. Although urine is beneficial, it is disrespectful to place it in a shofar, which serves for a mitzvah. One would also think that it might, if you then blew the shofar without thoroughly disinfecting it, it might not be very pleasant.
Nice. Okay, so what we get here is, what's interesting is the Talmud is, at least according to Steinsaltz, specifically speaking about on Rosh Hashanah. What we get here is a question that the Talmud asks, who is the attributable source for our Mishnah? Remember that the vast majority of Mishnayot are unattributed. And usually an unattributed Mishnah has a traditionally believed source, and that's Rabbi Meir. But here the Gemara asks who the source is, and they answer it by finding a Baraita, which looks suspiciously like our Mishnah, with one line cut out. Now, the one line that's cut out is the line that has the explanation, right? What's the explanation? That it makes sound clear, right? And it is mutar letzach tzech. That it is, and the word letzach tzech is to make clear, but it could also mean to polish, to varnish, or to shine. So we're not entirely clear how it's being used in Mishnah.
It's also used to brush your teeth.
Right, your letzach tzech, your shinayim. Very good. But it's always dangerous to import backwards the translation and understanding of something. So when Steinsaltz says letzach tzech is to make clear, we should probably trust it, although we don't have to. We can be postmodern and say, you know, why would you have ever rubbed wine on a shofar? You know, and a better question is, how much does the putting of water or wine into a shofar change the sound? Which is, you know, we can do a test here. But with regard to urine, it is prohibited because of kavod, because of respect. Okay, so I wanted to say 3 things and then we'll call it a day because it's a great natural stopping place. The question again, and I was bringing this up with Bone, is what is this broader category of icky things with regard to ritual objects that, or not even non-ritual objects that one might be forbidden for doing? So Steinsaltz brings up a commentary by the shofar, in which he says, Mishtamshim b'tzavat kelavim la'avod klaf, af lemutarot ketivat sefer kodesh, hare sham naaseh hadavar bishlav rishon shel ha'ibud v'lo kashehu muchan kavar likdusha. Even though one might be allowed to use dog poop as a writing implement on paper, one should not do so with regard to kedusha. So if you're going to write with dog poop, don't do Torah or Talmud or halacha. Choose to write a letter to your best friend instead, right? Now, begging the question, why would someone use dog poop in order to write a letter? The answer is we use manure and feces for all kinds of purposes. And again, back in those days, they used it for a variety of things. I'm thinking, I know, and for some of you, you'll say like, well, that's gross, but people do it. Some of you may have heard of civet coffee, right? Civet coffee is coffee that has been digested in the digestive systems of civets and then pooped out. People claim, Google it, I promise. People claim that the stomach acids of the civet in Southeast Asia do something to mellow the acidity of the coffee bean, and therefore the finest coffee in the world is that which has been eaten and pooped out by a civet. Now, you may say that's gross, I would never do that, but people do this and they pay a lot of money for it, okay? Another one is, and this is true, there is elephant poo paper, and this is real. Elephant feces, because they eat so much grass and leaves, when they poop, it's basically like, it's basically very, very, when you press that and you clean it, it turns into this really nice paper, and it's a very environmentally friendly way of getting paper. It's expensive, and it seems gross, but it is really a thing. You can Google elephant poo and paper. I promise it exists. And the final version that I'll bring up is the thing that is mentioned here in the Talmud. Ukfar hashavu din zeh le'inyan haketoret she'af ba isur me'ototam shimush b'mei raglayim letzachtzech v'yesh lomar shekashem sheketoret ba likodesh af t'kiyat shofar nachshevet ka'avod panim kevan shehu lizichron. So there's an argument that's being made here that poop is sometimes used, or pee, I think is specific. Urine is being used in ketoret, in incense, right? It is a thing that gets mixed in to make incense. And there's like a kal v'chomer that was attempted to be applied right there in that sentence, which is, you might have thought that because urine might be permitted in the ketoret, which is kodesh, therefore you might also be allowed to use it in the shofar, which is also kodesh, aval lo. You are not allowed to do this. So the thing that we all kind of said is, why would anyone in their right mind use urine on a shofar? And the answer is, there are lots of reasons why one might have thought that urine on a shofar would be perfectly permissible. The Talmud kind of lays it out. And finally, we have a clarification that I'll finish with for today on this question of the fact that it says you can't do it on Rosh Hashanah. The halacha in the Shulchan Aruch is as follows. Mutar latet b'toch shofar mayim o yain o chometz kedei letzachtzech. One can put water or wine or vinegar on a shofar in order to polish it. Aval mei raglayim asur letet litocho afilu bachol. Okay, that's the important word. However, urine, it is forbidden for one to put inside a shofar, even on non-Rosh Hashanah days, on Chol. Mipnei she'eno kavod lemitzvah, because it is not respectful for the mitzvah. Shehalacha ka'Abba Shaul, and the law follows Abba Shaul. And that's how we finish. So what we get here really interestingly is the Talmud basically says this is a law that falls out only on Rosh Hashanah, but the later codes in the 15th century and the 16th century say, yeah, actually, we're going to extrapolate this out to every day. They understand that where it says for kavod, it really applies 365, 24/7. All right, that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed today's class, and we'll see you next